In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1886, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred like a mirage, one man's duty would test everything he believed about honor, justice, and the human heart. When Sergeant Thomas McKenna was ordered to guard the last free Apache warrior, a fierce woman named Ayanna who had never known the confines of walls or the weight of chains, he thought it would be the simplest assignment of his military career. He was wrong. What began as a routine prisoner detail would become a journey that challenged the very foundations of everything the frontier had taught him about enemies and allies, captivity and freedom, and what it truly means to be human in a world torn apart by war and misunderstanding. This is the true story of two souls from opposite worlds, bound together by circumstance and separated by everything they had been taught to believe about each other, and how sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't holding someone captive, but setting them free. The dust never settled in Fort Huachuca. It swirled around the adobe buildings like restless spirits, coating everything in a fine layer of Arizona grit that seemed to work its way into a man's soul. Sergeant Thomas McKenna had grown accustomed to many things during his 3 years stationed in the territory: the relentless heat. General Crook wants her transferred to the reservation, but there's been some complications. The sergeant waited, knowing better than to press his commanding officer for information that would come in due time. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of the fort coming to life: horses whinnying in the corral, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against anvil, soldiers calling to one another as they went about their morning duties. Normal sounds of a normal day that was about to become anything but normal. "She's been held at Fort Apache for the past month," Harrison continued, wiping sweat from his brow with a yellowed handkerchief. "Refuses to eat, won't speak to anyone, and has already attempted to escape twice. The commanding officer there requested she be moved somewhere more secure." Thomas nodded, though he wondered what made them think Fort Huachuca would be any more secure than Fort Apache. Both outposts were undermanned and stretched thin, trying to maintain peace in a land where peace seemed as elusive as morning mist in the desert. "What's my assignment exactly, sir?" "Guard her. Keep her alive. Make sure she doesn't escape before the transfer papers come through." Harrison's voice carried the weight of a man giving orders he didn't particularly like. "And, McKenna, she's not to be mistreated. Those are direct orders from Washington. The Apache wars are winding down, and there's talk of politicians back east wanting to know how we're handling the transition." The way the colonel said transition made it sound like something clean and simple, like changing guard duty or switching from winter to summer uniforms. Thomas knew better. He'd seen what the transition looked like: proud warriors reduced to begging for government rations, families torn apart and scattered to different reservations, a way of life that had existed for generations simply erased by the stroke of a pen. "Understood, sir. Where will she be housed?" "The old storage building behind the mess hall has been converted into a holding cell. Windows are barred, door reinforced. Should be sufficient." Harrison paused, studying Thomas carefully. "I'm choosing you for this because you've got a level head, McKenna. Some of the men here, well, they've lost friends to Apache raids. Their judgment might be clouded by personal feelings." Thomas understood. He'd been fortunate, if you could call it that, to arrive in Arizona after most of the heavy fighting had ended. He'd never lost close friends to Apache attacks, never seen the aftermath of a raid on a settlement or wagon train. His perspective on the Apache people was shaped more by curiosity than hatred, though he'd been careful to keep such thoughts to himself in a garrison where most men viewed any Apache as a deadly enemy. "When should I expect the prisoner, sir?" "Escort should arrive around 3 this afternoon. Prepare the holding area and make sure your sidearm is clean and loaded." "And, McKenna?" The colonel's voice took on a warning tone. "Don't underestimate her because she's a woman. The reports say she killed 2 soldiers during her capture and wounded 3 others. She's dangerous." An hour later, Thomas stood in the converted storage building that would serve as a prison cell, running his fingers along the newly installed iron bars that covered the single window. The space was small, barely large enough for a cot, a wash basin, and a chamber pot. The walls were thick adobe that stayed relatively cool even in the afternoon heat, but the room felt oppressive, like a tomb. He tried to imagine what it would be like for someone who had spent their entire life under the open sky to be confined in such a space. The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was because he'd grown up on a farm in Ohio, where the horizon stretched endlessly and a man could walk for miles without seeing another soul. Even here at the fort, surrounded by walls and regulations, he sometimes felt the weight of confinement. As he checked the door's heavy lock for the third time, Thomas found himself wondering about this woman named Ayanna. What had driven her to keep fighting when the rest of her people had surrendered? What made someone choose almost certain death over capture? He'd heard stories of Apache warriors who would rather die than be taken alive, but those stories always involved men. The idea of a woman continuing to resist when all hope was lost intrigued him in ways that probably weren't appropriate for a soldier assigned to guard her. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Through the barred window, he could see a small cloud of dust on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the fort's main gate. Thomas checked his pocket watch, 2:30 in the afternoon. The escort was arriving early. He straightened his uniform and made his way toward the front gate, where a small crowd was already gathering. News traveled fast in an isolated outpost like Fort Huachuca, and the arrival of an Apache prisoner was enough to draw attention from soldiers who had little else to break the monotony of frontier duty. The escort consisted of 6 mounted soldiers, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with exhaustion. In the center of the group rode a 7th horse, its rider bound and hooded. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the tension in the way she sat in the saddle, her shoulders straight and defiant despite the restraints. Captain Morris, the fort's second-in-command, stepped forward as the escort approached. "Sergeant Hernandez, I trust the journey was uneventful?" The lead rider dismounted, dust billowing from his uniform as his boots hit the ground. "Not exactly, sir. She tried to escape twice during the trip. Had to hobble her horse and keep her hooded after the second attempt." Thomas moved closer, studying the prisoner as 2 soldiers helped her dismount. The hood that covered her head was made of rough burlap, and he could see dark hair spilling out from beneath it. Her hands were bound behind her back with rope that looked far too tight, and her ankles were shackled with iron chains that must have made riding incredibly difficult. "Remove the hood," Captain Morris ordered. When the burlap was pulled away, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Ayanna was nothing like what he had expected. The stories and reports had painted a picture of a savage warrior, someone wild and fearsome. Instead, he saw a woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s, with striking features and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with sharp intelligence. Her skin was bronzed by the sun, and her long black hair was braided with small pieces of turquoise and silver that caught the afternoon light. But it was her eyes that held Thomas's attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and they burned with a fierce pride that seemed untouched by her current circumstances. As her gaze swept across the assembled soldiers, Thomas felt as though she was memorizing each face, cataloging every detail of her surroundings for future reference. When her eyes met his, he felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, as though they had met before in some other time or place. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw something flicker across her features, not fear or hatred, as he might have expected, but curiosity. Then, her expression hardened again, and she looked away. "Sergeant McKenna," Captain Morris called. "This prisoner is now your responsibility. Make sure she's secured in the holding cell and post a guard rotation. I want someone watching her at all times." Thomas stepped forward, uncertain how to handle the transfer. The woman's dignity struck him forcefully, even in chains. She carried herself like royalty forced to endure the temporary inconvenience of peasants who didn't know any better. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not sure if she understood English but feeling compelled to address her respectfully. "I'll be escorting you to your quarters." Ayanna's head turned sharply at the sound of his voice, and once again their eyes met. This time he was prepared for the intensity of her gaze, but not for what he saw there. Behind the defiance and pride, he glimpsed something that looked almost like surprise. "She speaks English," Sergeant Hernandez said. "Learned it from missionaries when she was younger. But she hasn't said a word since her capture." Thomas nodded and gestured toward the path that led to the converted storage building. "This way." As they walked, Ayanna's chains clinked with each step, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the afternoon heat. Thomas found himself adjusting his pace to match hers, noting how the shackles forced her to take shorter steps than her natural stride would require. Other soldiers watched from doorways and windows as they passed, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. Private Johnson, a young soldier from Texas whose family had been killed in an Apache raid 3 years earlier, stepped into their path. "Sergeant, why don't you just put her in the stockade with the other prisoners? Seems like a waste to give an Apache her own private cell." Thomas felt the woman stiffen beside him, though her expression remained unchanged. "Orders from Colonel Harrison, Private. Please step aside." Johnson hesitated for a moment, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sidearm. Thomas recognized the look in the young man's eyes, the same mix of pain and anger he'd seen in too many soldiers who had personal reasons for hating the Apache. For a tense moment, Thomas wondered if he would have to draw his own weapon to protect his prisoner. Then, Ayanna spoke for the first time since her capture, her voice clear and strong despite weeks of silence. "Your anger burns you more than it burns me, young warrior." The words were spoken in perfect English, with only the slightest accent that suggested it wasn't her first language. Johnson's face went white, then red with fury. "You don't get to speak to me, savage," he snarled. "That's enough, Private," Thomas said sharply. "Return to your duties immediately." Johnson glared at both of them for a moment longer, then stalked away, his boots hitting the ground harder than necessary. Thomas watched him go, making a mental note to speak with Captain Morris about keeping certain soldiers away from the prisoner. "I apologize for that," Thomas said quietly as they continued walking. Ayanna glanced at him sideways. "You apologize for something you did not do?" It was the first real conversation they'd had, and Thomas found himself oddly nervous. "I apologize for the behavior of my fellow soldiers." "Why?" Her voice carried genuine curiosity now. "Are you responsible for all men in blue coats?" "No, but..." Thomas paused, realizing he wasn't sure how to answer that question. It wasn't right. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but Thomas sensed that something had shifted between them. When they reached the holding cell, he unlocked the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. Ayanna paused in the doorway, surveying the small space that would be her home for an indefinite period. She took in the cot, the wash basin, the single barred window that looked out on an empty stretch of desert. Her shoulders seemed to sag slightly as the reality of her situation settled over her. "I'll need to remove your shackles," Thomas said. "Will you give me your word that you won't try to escape while I'm doing so?" She turned to look at him with an expression of amazement. "You ask for my word?" "Yes." For a long moment, she studied his face as though trying to solve a puzzle. "Why would you trust the word of an Apache?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Because even enemies can have honor." Something changed in Ayanna's expression, a softening around her eyes that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "You have my word that I will not try to escape while you remove these chains." As Thomas knelt to unlock the shackles around her ankles, he was acutely aware of how close they were. He could smell the dust of travel on her clothes and something else, sage, perhaps, or some other desert plant he couldn't identify. Her stillness was complete as he worked, but he could feel the tension in her body, coiled and ready like a mountain cat preparing to spring. When the ankle shackles fell away, she flexed her feet gratefully. Thomas stood and moved behind her to untie the ropes around her wrists. As the bonds fell away, she brought her hands in front of her and rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him. Thomas stepped back toward the door. "I'll have food brought to you shortly." "Is there anything specific you need?" Ayanna walked to the window and placed her hands on the bars, staring out at the desert beyond. "I need the sky," she said. "I need the wind. I need the mountains that know my name." She turned back to him. "But I do not think you can bring me those things." The simple honesty of her answer struck Thomas harder than any curse or threat could have. "No," he said quietly. "I can't." As he locked the door behind him and walked away, Thomas found himself thinking about her words. "The mountains that know my name." He had never thought of the landscape as something that could know a person, but somehow her way of describing it made perfect sense. The Ohio farmland where he'd grown up had known his name once, in the way that familiar places hold memories and recognize the footsteps of those who belong there. Here in Arizona, he was a stranger in a strange land, someone passing through rather than someone who belonged. But Ayanna, she belonged to this desert the way a river belongs to its banks or a bird belongs to the sky. And now she was caged, cut off from everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. That night, as Thomas began his first watch outside her door, he found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. Was what they were doing justice, or was it simply the strong imposing their will on the weak? Was there honor in following orders that felt wrong in his gut, or was true honor in standing up for what seemed right, regardless of the consequences? He didn't have answers to those questions yet, but, as he listened to the soft sounds of movement from inside the cell, he realized that guarding Ayanna was going to be far more complicated than simply keeping her from escaping. She had already begun to escape from the neat categories he used to organize his world, and he suspected that before this assignment was over, she would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and what it meant to be human in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its humanity. The first week passed like a strange dance between captor and captive, each learning the rhythms of the other without acknowledging what was happening. Thomas found himself arriving earlier for his watches, staying later when his replacement came, and thinking about the woman in the cell far more than his duties required. Ayanna had established her own routines within the confines of her small prison. Each morning at dawn, she would stand at the barred window facing east, remaining motionless for nearly an hour as the sun rose over the distant mountains. Thomas had initially thought she was praying, but, when he mentioned it to her, she corrected him. "I am greeting the day," she explained simply. "Every sunrise is a gift that should be acknowledged." Her English was far better than Sergeant Hernandez had indicated. Thomas learned that she had spent 2 years with a missionary family when she was a child, after her parents died in a cavalry attack on their village. The missionaries had taught her to read and write, and had filled her head with stories of their God and their way of life. But, when she turned 16, she had walked away from their world and returned to live with her surviving relatives among the free Apache bands. "Why did you leave?" Thomas asked one evening as he brought her dinner. It was a question that had puzzled him since she'd first told him about her past. Ayanna accepted the plate of beans and hardtack without complaint, though he knew the food was far from what she was accustomed to eating. "They wanted me to become something I was not," she said. "They spoke of love, but their love came with conditions. Love me, but cut your hair. Love me, but forget your people. Love me, but pretend that your mother's songs never existed." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, drawn into the conversation despite the impropriety of a guard engaging in extended discussions with his prisoner. "Maybe they thought they were helping you." "Perhaps." She took a small bite of the beans, made a face, but continued eating. "But help that requires you to stop being yourself is not help. It is erasure." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thomas thought about the reservation system, about the government's plans for the Apache people, about the civilization that was supposed to make everything better. When viewed through Ayanna's eyes, it looked less like salvation and more like cultural murder. "What was your life like before?" he found himself asking. "Before the wars, I mean." A shadow crossed her face, but she answered. "We moved with the seasons. Spring in the high country where the water ran clear and the grass grew tall for the horses. Summer in the canyons where it was cool and the game was plentiful. Winter in the desert where the sun stayed warm and the wind couldn't find us." As she spoke, her voice took on a different quality, becoming almost musical. Thomas could see her in those places she described, free and wild and belonging to the land in a way he had never belonged anywhere. "We gathered what the earth offered freely," she continued. "Acorns and pine nuts, wild onions and cactus fruit. The men hunted deer and antelope. The women made baskets so tightly woven they could hold water. Children learned by watching and doing, not by sitting in rows being told things they could not see or touch." "It sounds peaceful," Thomas said, and meant it. "It was not always peaceful," Ayanna replied honestly. "There were raids and battles, conflicts with other tribes over hunting grounds or water rights. But it was our life, chosen by us, lived according to traditions that had worked for hundreds of generations. She set down her spoon and looked directly at him. When you take away someone's ability to choose how they live, you take away their humanity. Thomas had no answer for that. He had been raised to believe that the military brought order to chaos, that civilization was always preferable to what politicians called savage ways of life. But, listening to Ayanna describe her people's existence, he struggled to find anything savage about it. If anything, it sounded more civilized than the world he knew, a world where men killed each other over gold and land, where the strong preyed on the weak, where progress seemed to require the destruction of everything that came before. The second week brought changes that neither of them had expected. Colonel Harrison announced that the transfer to the reservation had been delayed indefinitely due to political complications in Washington. Some Eastern newspapers had begun questioning the Army's handling of Apache prisoners, and there were calls for congressional investigations into conditions at the reservations. "Looks like your guest will be staying longer than planned," the colonel told Thomas during their weekly briefing. "Make sure she remains healthy and unharmed. The last thing we need is for some reporter to show up and find that we've been mistreating prisoners." Thomas wanted to ask what the delay really meant, but he had learned not to question orders that came from above his pay grade. Still, he couldn't help but notice the colonel's choice of words. Ayanna had gone from being a prisoner to being a guest, at least in official conversations. The change in status brought unexpected privileges. Captain Morris authorized daily walks outside the cell, though Ayanna was to remain shackled and under constant guard. Thomas volunteered for the duty, telling himself it was simply to ensure that other soldiers didn't create problems. He tried not to examine his motivations too closely. Their first walk took them along the inside perimeter of the fort, past the stables and the blacksmith shop, around the parade ground where soldiers drilled in the afternoon heat. Ayanna said nothing during the entire circuit, but Thomas could see her drinking in the sights and sounds like someone dying of thirst finally finding water. "The mountains look different from here," she observed as they paused near the north wall. Thomas followed her gaze to the Dragoon Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks purple in the afternoon haze. "Different how?" "Farther away. Less real." She flexed her fingers, and Thomas noticed how white her knuckles were where she gripped the chain connecting her wrist shackles. When you can only see something through bars or over walls, it becomes like a painting instead of a place where you might walk. It was an insight that struck Thomas as both profound and heartbreaking. He had never thought about how physical barriers could change one's relationship with the landscape, but he understood what she meant. Looking at something you couldn't reach was fundamentally different from seeing something you might visit. "Would you like to walk outside the walls?" he heard himself asking, and immediately regretted the impulse. Ayanna turned to study his face with that intense gaze that always made him feel exposed. "Are you authorized to take me outside the fort?" "No," he admitted. "But I could request permission." "Why would you do that?" It was a good question, and Thomas wasn't sure he had a good answer. "Because everyone should be able to see the mountains properly." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression, a softening that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "You are not like the other soldiers," she said quietly. "How am I different?" "You see me," she said simply. "The others see Apache, or prisoner, or problem to be solved. You see a person who misses the mountains." That evening, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on his usual activities. He had been reading a book of poetry that his sister had sent from Ohio, but the words seemed flat and lifeless compared to the way Ayanna spoke about her homeland. He kept thinking about her observation that he saw her as a person rather than a category, and wondering when that had happened. When had she stopped being the Apache prisoner and started being Ayanna? The transformation had been gradual, he realized. It had begun with small things, the dignity she maintained despite her circumstances, the intelligence that shone in her eyes, the way she treated everyone with respect even when that respect wasn't returned. She had never begged or pleaded or tried to manipulate him with tears or feminine wiles. She had simply been herself, fully and completely, and somehow that authentic presence had broken down his preconceptions. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A middle-aged woman in travel-worn but expensive clothes arrived at the fort's gate, demanding to see the commanding officer. Thomas was summoned to Colonel Harrison's office to find the woman seated across from the colonel's desk, her spine straight and her expression determined. "Sergeant McKenna," the colonel said, clearly uncomfortable. "This is Mrs. Elizabeth Morgan from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She's here to inspect our facilities and interview our Apache prisoner." Mrs. Morgan stood and extended her hand, which Thomas shook cautiously. She was not what he had expected from a government bureaucrat. Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp and intelligent, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I understand you've been assigned as this woman's guard," she said without preamble. "I'd like to speak with her, and I'd like you to be present during the interview. May I ask the purpose of your visit, ma'am?" Mrs. Morgan's smile was thin but not unkind. "Congress is considering new legislation regarding the treatment of Indian prisoners and the administration of reservations. There have been concerns about current policies." Thomas exchanged glances with Colonel Harrison, who looked like a man being forced to swallow medicine he knew would taste terrible. "When would you like to conduct this interview?" "Now, if possible. I have a train to catch tomorrow morning." An hour later, Thomas found himself unlocking Ayana's cell while Mrs. Morgan waited behind him. He had tried to warn Ayana about the visitor, but she had simply nodded as though she had been expecting something like this. "Ma'am," Thomas said as Ayana stood, "this is Mrs. Morgan from Washington. She'd like to speak with you." Ayana's eyes went immediately to the government official, taking in her expensive clothes, her confident posture, her carefully styled hair. When she spoke, her voice was polite but wary. "Are you here to help my people, or to find new ways to hurt them?" Mrs. Morgan blinked, clearly not having expected such a direct question. "I'm here to gather information that will help Congress make informed decisions about Indian policy." "That is not an answer," Ayana replied. "Politicians always gather information. The question is what they do with it." Thomas watched the exchange with fascination. In just a few sentences, Ayana had managed to put a seasoned government official on the defensive while maintaining perfect courtesy. "Perhaps we could sit and talk," Mrs. Morgan suggested, gesturing toward the small chair Thomas had brought for the occasion. For the next hour, Thomas listened to one of the most extraordinary conversations he had ever witnessed. Mrs. Morgan asked careful, probing questions about Ayana's treatment, her living conditions, her health, and her understanding of the charges against her. But Ayana refused to be interviewed in the traditional sense. Instead, she turned the discussion into a dialogue about the fundamental assumptions underlying government policy toward her people. "You ask if I have been mistreated here," Ayana said. "But you do not ask whether keeping any human being in a cage is treatment or mistreatment. The cell is for your own protection as much as protection from whom?" Ayana interrupted gently. "From soldiers who hate me because of my blood? From politicians who see my people as obstacles to progress? From citizens who want our land but not our presence upon it?" She leaned forward slightly. "If you must protect me from all of these, perhaps the problem is not with me." Mrs. Morgan scribbled notes furiously, but Thomas could see that she was struggling to maintain her professional composure. Ayana was not providing the kind of testimony that would fit neatly into a government report. "What would you like to see happen to your people?" Mrs. Morgan finally asked. "I would like to see them remain my people," Ayana replied. "I would like children to learn their grandmother's songs and grandfather's stories. I would like young men to know how to track deer through pine forests and young women to know which plants heal and which plants harm. I would like families to stay together and clans to choose their own leaders." She paused, studying Mrs. Morgan's face. "But you are asking what I think will happen, not what I hope will happen. What do you think will happen?" "I think my people will be scattered like seeds in a windstorm. I think children will be taken from their families and taught to hate everything their ancestors loved. I think the old ones will die of sadness and the young ones will die of confusion, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither." Ayana's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. "And I think that 50 years from now, people will speak of the Apache as though we never existed, as though we were just stories told to frighten children." Mrs. Morgan stopped taking notes. "You paint a very dark picture." "I paint an honest picture. Your people are not evil, but your system is. It turns good men into agents of destruction and tells them they are bringing civilization. Ayanna glanced at Thomas. Even the kindest of your soldiers cannot free me, because he serves a machine that is bigger than both of us. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. In front of this government official, Ayanna had just called him kind while simultaneously pointing out the limitations of his kindness. It was both a compliment and a challenge, and he wasn't sure how to respond to either. Mrs. Morgan closed her notebook and stood. Thank you for your time. Your insights will be valuable. After the official had left, Thomas remained in the cell, uncertain whether he should stay or go. The interview had left him feeling exposed and confused, as though everything he thought he understood about his role here had been called into question. You did not have to say what you said about me, he finally said. Ayanna was back at her window, looking out at the mountains. It was true. But it put me in an uncomfortable position. She turned to look at him. Good. Good. Comfort is the enemy of growth, she said. If you are comfortable with keeping me in a cage, then you have stopped growing as a person. If you are uncomfortable, then perhaps you will eventually find the courage to do what is right instead of what is ordered. Thomas wanted to argue with her, to defend his position and his duty, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself asking, what would be right? Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since her arrival. That is something only you can answer, Thomas McKenna. But the fact that you asked the question gives me hope. It was the first time she had used his name, and hearing it in her voice sent an unexpected thrill through him. Later that night, as he lay in his narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, Thomas realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The careful professional distance he had maintained was crumbling, replaced by something that felt dangerous and electric and absolutely forbidden. He was falling in love with his prisoner, and he had no idea what he was going to do about it. 3 weeks after Mrs. Morgan's visit, Thomas received permission to take Ayanna outside the fort walls for supervised walks. The authorization came with strict conditions: she was to remain shackled, stay within sight of the guards on the walls, and return at the first sign of trouble. But, for Ayanna, even these limited freedoms felt like resurrection. The first time they walked beyond the gates, she stopped just past the threshold and stood perfectly still for several minutes, her eyes closed and her face turned toward the sky. Thomas watched her breathing slow and deepen, as though she was remembering how to fill her lungs properly. Better, he asked quietly. Yes, she whispered. The walls muffle everything: sounds, smells, even the light seems different when it has to pass through bars. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Thank you for making this possible. They established a route that took them east toward a small grove of mesquite trees, then south along a dry creek bed that showed signs of occasional flooding. It wasn't the high country Ayanna had described, but it was open space under an unlimited sky, and Thomas could see her spirits lift each time they made the walk. On their fourth excursion, she stopped beside a large boulder and knelt despite the awkwardness of her shackles. Thomas watched her pick up a handful of red dirt and let it sift through her fingers. This is good earth, she said. My grandmother would have known what plants grow here, what animals come to drink when the rains fill the creek. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. Knowledge dies when there is no one left to teach it. Couldn't you teach someone? Ayanna's laugh was bitter. Who would I teach? The children on the reservation are forbidden to speak Apache. The young men are learning to farm land that was never meant for farming. The young women are learning to cook white women's food and wear white women's clothes. She turned to face the mountains in the distance. What good is knowledge of the old ways in the new world you are building? Thomas had no answer for that, but her words stayed with him as they walked back toward the fort. That evening, he found himself in the small library that served the fort's officers, looking through books on Apache culture and history. What he found disturbed him more than he had expected. The government's policy toward Indian tribes wasn't simply about moving people from one place to another, it was about systematically destroying everything that made them who they were. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages. Traditional religious practices were banned. Even clothing and hairstyles were regulated to force conformity with white standards. It was, Thomas realized, exactly what Ayanna had called it, erasure. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A telegram arrived from Washington announcing that President Cleveland had ordered a comprehensive review of Indian policy, and all prisoner transfers were suspended pending the outcome of congressional hearings. Ayanna would remain at Fort Huachuca indefinitely. Colonel Harrison called Thomas into his office to discuss the implications. This could be good news or bad news, Sergeant, depending on how you look at it. The good news is that we don't have to worry about transport arrangements. The bad news is that we're now responsible for an Apache prisoner for the foreseeable future. How long might that be, sir? Could be months. Could be years. Politics moves slowly, especially when there's this much controversy involved. The colonel leaned back in his chair. I need to know that you're prepared to continue this assignment for the long term. Thomas considered the question more carefully than the colonel probably expected. Was he prepared to guard Ayanna indefinitely? The honest answer was complicated. The professional part of him could handle the duty, it wasn't particularly difficult work, and the fort was stable enough that he didn't anticipate problems. But the personal part of him was growing more troubled by the day. His feelings for Ayanna had developed beyond simple respect or sympathy. He found himself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that seemed dangerous. He caught himself studying her face when she wasn't aware of his attention, noting the way sunlight brought out copper highlights in her dark hair or how her eyes crinkled slightly when she was thinking about something that amused her. I can handle the assignment, sir, he said finally. Good. But, McKenna? The colonel's voice carried a note of warning. I've noticed that you spend more time with the prisoner than your duties strictly require. Make sure you maintain proper professional boundaries. Heat rose in Thomas's cheeks. Yes, sir. That afternoon, as they took their usual walk outside the walls, Thomas found himself more aware than ever of the impropriety of his situation. He was developing feelings for a woman who was completely dependent on him for her basic needs, someone who had no choice but to accept his company and conversation. The power imbalance made any genuine relationship impossible, even if military regulations didn't already forbid it. But, when Ayanna stopped to examine a flowering cactus and looked up at him with genuine delight in her eyes, his careful resolutions crumbled. Look, she said, pointing to tiny red blooms that crowned the prickly pear. Life finding a way even in the harshest places. Thomas knelt beside her, close enough that he could smell sage in her hair and feel the warmth radiating from her skin in the afternoon heat. It's beautiful. My people have a saying, she said softly. The flower does not ask the desert for permission to bloom. Their eyes met, and Thomas felt the air between them become charged with unspoken possibilities. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, he thought about what it would be like to touch her face, to feel her lips against his, to hold her without chains between them. Then, reality crashed back. He was a soldier. She was his prisoner. What he was feeling was not only forbidden but potentially dangerous for both of them. We should head back, he said, standing abruptly. Ayanna nodded, but something had changed in her expression. As they walked toward the fort, Thomas realized that the moment beside the cactus had been a turning point. She had felt it too, the electric connection that sparked between them whenever their guards were down. That evening brought an unexpected complication. Private Johnson, the young soldier from Texas who had confronted them on Ayanna's first day, appeared at the door of her cell during Thomas's watch. Sergeant, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I need to speak with you. Thomas stepped away from the door, not wanting Ayanna to overhear whatever Johnson had to say. What is it, Private? The men are talking, sir. About you and the Apache woman. About how much time you spend with her, how you look at her. Johnson's face was flushed with anger or embarrassment. It ain't right, sir. It ain't right at all. Private Johnson, you're out of line, am I? Johnson's voice rose. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're getting mighty friendly with someone who killed American soldiers. Someone whose people murdered my family. Thomas felt his own anger rising, but he forced his voice to remain steady. What I do or don't do is not your concern, Private. Return to your quarters immediately. It is my concern when it affects morale, sir. When good soldiers start wondering if their sergeants can be trusted to do their duty. Johnson took a step closer, his hand resting on his sidearm. Maybe she's put some kind of spell on you. I've heard Indians can do that. That's enough, Thomas said sharply. You're dismissed. But Johnson didn't move. Or maybe you're just weak. Maybe you're the kind of man who gets soft when a woman bats her eyes at him, even if she's a murdering savage. Thomas's hand moved to his own weapon. Private Johnson, you're dangerously close to insubordination. Stand down immediately. For a tense moment, the two men faced each other in the growing darkness. Thomas could see the hatred burning in Johnson's eyes, fueled by genuine grief but twisted into something ugly and dangerous. He realized that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Ayanna arrived at the fort. Finally, Johnson stepped back. Yes, sir. But this isn't over, Sergeant. The men are watching you. After Johnson left, Thomas stood in the darkness outside Ayanna's cell, trying to calm his racing heart. He had been naive to think that his growing attachment to his prisoner would go unnoticed. In a small garrison like Fort Huachuca, privacy was almost impossible to maintain. He is afraid of me, Ayanna's voice came softly from inside the cell. Thomas turned to find her sitting on her cot, visible through the barred window. You heard? I heard enough. He lost family to Apache raids, and now he sees me as revenge he cannot take. Her voice was sad rather than angry. I understand his pain. I have lost family to soldiers like him. That doesn't excuse his behavior. No, but it explains it. Hatred is usually grief wearing a mask. She moved to the window, her fingers wrapping around the iron bars. He is also afraid of you. Afraid of me? Why? Because you see me as human, and that threatens the story he tells himself about my people. If I am human, then perhaps the children who died in his family's village were human too. If I am human, then the wars your people fought to take this land become more complicated than simple good fighting evil. Thomas had never thought about the psychological burden that soldiers like Johnson carried. How did a man live with himself after killing children, even in the heat of battle? Perhaps it was easier to believe that your enemies weren't fully human, that their lives mattered less than your own. Are you human? He asked, then immediately felt foolish for asking such an obvious question. But Ayanna didn't laugh. When I was taken from my family as a child and lived with the missionaries, they taught me that humans are made in the image of their God. They said this made humans different from animals, gave them souls and moral responsibility. She was quiet for a moment. But they seemed to think that some humans were more in the image of their God than others. What do you think? I think humans are the animals that tell themselves stories, she said. We create meaning where none exists, find patterns where there are only coincidences, build elaborate explanations for simple things. She turned to look at him through the bars. The story you tell yourself about me is changing, isn't it? Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. That frightens you. Yes, he admitted. Good, she said. Fear means you understand that something important is at stake. The question is whether you will choose the easy story or the true story. Over the following days, Thomas became increasingly aware of the scrutiny he was under. Other soldiers watched him when he thought they weren't looking. Conversations stopped when he entered the mess hall. He caught whispered exchanges that ceased abruptly when he approached. Captain Morris called him in for what was ostensibly a routine check on the prisoner's status, but Thomas could tell that the real purpose was to evaluate his fitness for the assignment. Any problems with the Apache woman? Morris asked, shuffling through papers on his desk. No, sir. She's been cooperative. No escape attempts? No signs of planning anything? None that I've observed, sir. Morris looked up. And you've been observant, haven't you, Sergeant? Spending considerable time with her, I understand. I maintain the security watch as ordered, sir. Of course you do. Morris set down his pen and studied Thomas carefully. "But some of the men have expressed concerns about your professional demeanor." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that suggest you might be getting too personally involved with your prisoner." Morris's voice was neither condemning nor sympathetic, it was purely professional. "I need to know that I can count on you to do your duty, regardless of any personal feelings you might have developed." "You can count on me, sir." "Can I?" "Because if there came a time when you had to choose between following orders and protecting her, which would you choose?" It was the question Thomas had been avoiding, the one that lay at the heart of his growing conflict. "I would follow orders, sir. Even if those orders were to transfer her to a reservation where conditions might be harsh? Even if those orders were to allow other soldiers to guard her, soldiers who might not share your sympathy for her situation?" Thomas hesitated, and, in that hesitation, both men found their answer. "I see," Morris said quietly. "Sergeant, I'm going to give you some advice. You're a good soldier and a good man, but you're walking a very dangerous line. If you can't maintain professional boundaries with this prisoner, I'll have to find someone who can." That night, Thomas lay awake wrestling with Captain Morris's words. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate duty from personal feelings, to follow orders regardless of his private opinions. But Ayanna had somehow slipped past all his defenses, making him question not just his orders but the entire system they represented. He thought about Private Johnson's accusations, about the whispers in the mess hall, about Captain Morris's warning. He thought about his military career, the pension he was working toward, the life he had planned for himself after his service ended. Then, he thought about Ayanna standing in the desert sunlight, her face turned toward mountains that called her name, and he realized that some things mattered more than plans and pensions and the approval of other soldiers. The question was no longer whether his feelings for her were appropriate or professional. The question was what he was going to do about them, and what price he was willing to pay for doing what felt right instead of what was expected. Winter came early to the Arizona Territory that year, bringing cold winds that whistled through the gaps in the fort's adobe walls and reminding everyone that even the desert could be harsh and unforgiving. For Ayanna, confined to her small cell with only a single thin blanket, the dropping temperatures posed a serious threat to her health. Thomas had already requested additional blankets and warmer clothing for her, but military bureaucracy moved slowly, and supply shipments to remote outposts were often delayed or diverted. When he arrived for his evening watch to find her shivering despite wearing every piece of clothing she owned, he made a decision that would have consequences neither of them could foresee. "This won't do," he said, unlocking her cell door. "You'll catch pneumonia." Ayanna looked up from where she sat huddled on her cot, surprised by the sound of the key in the lock. "Where are we going?" "My quarters," Thomas said, then immediately realized how that sounded. "Just until I can find you better blankets. The stove in my room will keep you warm." She studied his face carefully. "Is this wise?" "Probably not," he admitted. "But it's right." Thomas's quarters were Spartan by civilian standards but luxurious compared to Ayanna's cell. A small wood-burning stove filled one corner, radiating blessed warmth throughout the room. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a simple desk, and a trunk that held his few personal belongings completed the furnishings. Ayanna stood in the center of the room, still wearing her shackles, taking in her temporary surroundings. "You have books," she observed, noting the small shelf beside his desk. "A few. Poetry mostly, and some history." Thomas busied himself adding wood to the stove, partly to build up the fire and partly to have something to do with his hands. Having her in his private space felt simultaneously natural and terrifying. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the bookshelf. Thomas unlocked her wrist shackles so she could handle the books more easily, a liberty that would have scandalized his superiors if they had known. Ayanna immediately went to the shelf and began examining the volumes with the careful attention of someone for whom books were rare treasures. "Walt Whitman," she said, pulling out a worn copy of Leaves of Grass. "I know this one. The missionaries had a copy. What did you think of it?" She opened the book and read aloud, "For every atom belonging to me is good belongs to you." Her voice gave the familiar words a different quality, making them sound fresh and newly minted. He understood that all things are connected, that what hurts one hurts all. Thomas had read those lines dozens of times, but hearing them from Ayana's lips made him understand them in a new way. The missionaries approved of Whitman? They did not. Her smile was mischievous. I found the book hidden behind other books. I think one of them was ashamed of liking such worldly poetry. She moved to the chair beside the stove and settled into it with a sigh of relief, still holding the book. In the warm light of the fire, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her face relaxed for the first time in weeks, she looked nothing like the fierce Apache warrior who had been brought to the fort in chains. "Tell me about your family," Thomas said, taking a seat on the edge of his bed. "Before the wars, I mean." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the cover of the poetry book. "I had a brother named Nailnish. It means he works hard in your language. He was 3 years older than me and thought he was responsible for keeping me out of trouble." Her smile was soft with memory. "He was not very successful at that task." "What kind of trouble did you get into?" "The kind that comes from curiosity. I wanted to know how everything worked, why things happened the way they did. I would follow the hunters to see how they tracked game, though I was supposed to stay with the other children. I would sneak out at night to listen to the elders tell stories that were not meant for young ears." She looked up at Thomas. "I was always asking questions that had no simple answers." "Like what?" "Like why the rain came when the shamans danced, but sometimes came when they did not dance. Like why some babies were born healthy and others were born sick, regardless of how many prayers were said for them. Like why the white soldiers killed Apache children if their God taught them that all children were precious." Thomas winced at the last question. "What answers did you find?" "That the world is more complicated than any of our stories about it. That mystery is not the same as meaning. That sometimes there are no good choices, only choices with different kinds of consequences." She set the book aside and looked directly at him. "Like the choice you are making now." "What choice is that?" "To see me as a woman rather than a prisoner. To risk your career and your reputation for someone you barely know." Her voice was gentle but serious. "Why are you doing this, Thomas?" He had asked himself the same question countless times over the past weeks, but he had never found a satisfactory answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because keeping you locked in that cell feels like participating in something wrong. Maybe because you deserve better treatment than you've received. Maybe because..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Maybe because what?" Thomas stood and walked to the small window that looked out over the parade ground. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the desert landscape with an alien whiteness that transformed the familiar into something strange and beautiful. "Maybe because I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and transformative. Thomas had not planned to say them, but, once spoken, they felt inevitable. "I know," Ayana said softly. He turned to face her. "You know? I have known for some time. Just as I have known that I am falling in love with you." The admission hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had hoped for it and feared it in equal measure, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that changed everything. "This is impossible," he said. "Even if I weren't your guard, even if military regulations didn't forbid it, we come from different worlds. Your people and mine are at war." "We're at war," she corrected. "The fighting is over, even if the peace has not yet begun." She stood and moved toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "And love does not ask permission from governments or armies." When she reached him, she placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. Thomas could feel the warmth of her palm through his shirt, could smell sage and wood smoke in her hair. Every instinct told him to step away, to maintain the professional distance that duty required. Instead, he covered her hand with his own. "What happens now?" he asked. "I do not know," she said honestly. "But I know that denying what we feel will not make it disappear. It will only make us smaller." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside his quarters sent them springing apart. He gestured frantically for Ayanna to move away from the window as someone knocked on his door. "Sergeant McKenna?" It was Private Wilson, one of the younger soldiers. "Captain Morris wants to see you immediately, sir." Thomas's mind raced. Had someone seen him bring Ayanna to his quarters? Had Wilson noticed light under his door when there should have been none? "I'll be right there, Private." "Yes, sir." "He's waiting in his office." As Wilson's footsteps retreated, Thomas quickly helped Ayanna back into her shackles, hating himself for the necessity but knowing they had no choice. "I have to take you back to your cell before I report to Captain Morris." She nodded, understanding the precarious nature of their situation. "Thomas," she said as he prepared to unlock the door. "Whatever happens, do not regret what you have told me tonight. Truth is always better than silence, even when it brings complications." They walked back to her cell in heavy silence, both knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. As Thomas locked the door behind her, he wondered if this would be the last private conversation they would ever have. Captain Morris was waiting in his office, his face grave in the lamplight. "Sergeant, I've received disturbing reports about your conduct with the prisoner." Thomas's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of reports, sir?" "Reports that you've been taking her outside the fort without proper authorization. Reports that you've been spending extended periods alone with her. Reports that suggest your relationship with this woman has become inappropriate." "Sir, I was authorized to take her outside for supervised walks." "Supervised by whom?" Morris interrupted. "According to my information, you've been taking her out alone, beyond the sight of the wall guards. That constitutes a serious breach of security protocol." Thomas realized that someone had been watching their movements more carefully than he had known. The prisoner needed fresh air and exercise. "Her health was deteriorating." "Her health is not your primary concern, Sergeant. Security is. And, right now, you represent a security risk." Morris leaned back in his chair. "I'm relieving you of this assignment, effective immediately. Private Johnson will take over guard duties starting tomorrow morning." The news hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Johnson's hatred for Ayanna was well known, and his lack of experience made him likely to create problems. "Sir, I respectfully request that you reconsider. Private Johnson has expressed strong negative feelings about the prisoner." "Private Johnson's feelings are irrelevant. He'll follow orders, which is more than I can say for you." Morris stood, indicating that the conversation was over. "You're reassigned to quartermaster duties pending a full review of your conduct. Clear out any personal items from the guard station and report to Sergeant Harris in the morning." Thomas saluted and left the office, his mind reeling. As he walked across the parade ground toward his quarters, he tried to process what had just happened. Not only had he been removed from his assignment, but Ayanna was now in the hands of a man who saw her as less than human. That night, Thomas lay awake listening to the wind howl around the fort's walls and thinking about Private Johnson standing guard outside Ayanna's cell. He thought about her sitting alone in that cold, cramped space, wondering what had become of the one person in the fort who had treated her with dignity and respect. Most of all, he thought about her words, "Truth is always better than silence, even when it brings complications." The complications were certainly mounting. His career was in jeopardy, his reputation was in ruins, and the woman he had fallen in love with was now beyond his ability to protect. But, as he finally drifted off to sleep, Thomas realized that he didn't regret a single moment of the past weeks. For the first time in his life, he had acted from the heart instead of from duty, and, regardless of the consequences, that felt like victory rather than defeat. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again. A telegram had arrived during the night, and the fort was buzzing with activity. Thomas learned the details from Sergeant Harris when he reported for his new duties in the quartermaster's office. "Congressional committee is coming here," Harris explained as he showed Thomas around the supply depot. "Some big investigation into Indian policy. They'll be here within the week to inspect facilities and interview prisoners." "Prisoners?" Thomas asked, his pulse quickening. "Just the one, as far as I know. That Apache woman who's been causing all the fuss." Harris shot him a meaningful look. Word is they're particularly interested in how she's been treated. Thomas felt a mixture of hope and terror. A congressional investigation could mean vindication for Ayanna, proof that her treatment had been unjust. But it could also mean increased scrutiny of everyone involved in her case, including himself. "Who's coming?" he asked. Senator Morrison from the Indian Affairs Committee, plus some other politicians and a couple of newspaper reporters. Harris grimaced. "Colonel's in a panic. Wants everything perfect by the time they arrive." That afternoon, as Thomas inventoried ammunition supplies, he caught glimpses of increased activity around Ayanna's cell. Workers were painting the exterior walls, and someone had installed new bars on her window. The message was clear: the fort was preparing for inspection, but the improvements were cosmetic rather than substantial. As evening approached, Thomas found excuses to walk past the guard station, hoping to catch sight of Ayanna or at least confirm that she was unharmed. What he saw made his blood run cold. Private Johnson sat outside her door, drinking from a flask that he made no attempt to hide. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that the young soldier was intoxicated, and his conversation with whoever was inside the cell carried the aggressive tone of someone looking for a fight. Thomas knew he should report Johnson's drinking to Captain Morris, but he also knew that doing so would only confirm his superior's suspicions about his motives. Instead, he retreated to his quarters and spent the evening pacing and worrying, wondering what he could do to help Ayanna without making her situation worse. The answer came to him just before dawn, and it was both simple and terrifying. If he truly loved her, if he truly believed that her imprisonment was unjust, then there was only one choice that mattered. He was going to help her escape. The plan formed slowly in Thomas's mind over 3 sleepless nights. It would have to be simple; complex schemes required too many variables that could go wrong. It would have to happen soon, before the congressional committee arrived and security was increased. Most importantly, it would have to appear as though Ayanna had escaped on her own, without his assistance. Thomas had one advantage: his new assignment in the quartermaster's office gave him access to supplies and equipment that a guard wouldn't normally handle. He also had intimate knowledge of the fort's routines and weaknesses, gained from 3 years of service. But he had one enormous disadvantage: Private Johnson. Johnson's drinking had grown worse over the 3 days since he'd taken over guard duty. Thomas had observed the young soldier stumbling to his post each evening, flask in hand, eyes already glazed with alcohol and hatred. He had also noticed that Johnson's attention was increasingly focused on tormenting his prisoner rather than maintaining proper security. On the 3rd night, Thomas's worst fears were confirmed when he heard shouting from the direction of Ayanna's cell. Against his better judgment, he left his quarters and moved closer, staying in the shadows cast by the mess hall. Johnson was standing at the cell door, weaving slightly as he spoke in a voice loud enough to wake half the fort. "You think you're better than us, don't you? You think because that soft-hearted sergeant treated you special, you're some kind of princess." Thomas couldn't hear Ayanna's response, if she made one, but Johnson's agitation increased. "Well, he's gone now, and it's just you and me. And I know what you really are." Johnson fumbled with his keys. "Maybe it's time someone taught you your place." The sound of the cell door opening sent ice through Thomas's veins. He was too far away to intervene directly, and calling out would only alert Johnson to his presence while potentially making things worse for Ayanna. Instead, he ran back to his quarters and grabbed his service revolver, then sprinted toward the guard station as fast as his legs could carry him. He arrived to find Johnson inside the cell, backing Ayanna against the far wall. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see the terror in her eyes and the predatory intent in Johnson's posture. "Private Johnson," Thomas called sharply from the doorway. "Stand down immediately." Johnson spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. When he saw Thomas, his face twisted into a snarl. Well. Look who's come crawling back. Still playing protector to your Apache whore? Private, you're drunk and out of line. Return to your quarters and I'll pretend this never happened." "You'll pretend?" Johnson laughed bitterly. "You're not my superior officer anymore, McKenna. You're nothing but a disgraced quartermaster who got too friendly with the enemy." Thomas could see that reasoning with Johnson was impossible. The young soldier was beyond rational thought, fueled by alcohol and years of suppressed rage. "Private, I'm warning you one last time. Step away from the prisoner. Or what? You'll shoot a fellow soldier to protect an Apache killer?" Johnson's hand rested on his pistol grip. "That would be treason, wouldn't it?" The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, dangerous and unstable. Thomas was acutely aware that his own weapon was drawn, that shooting Johnson would indeed be considered treason by a military court, and that his career and, possibly his life hung in the balance. Then, Ayanna spoke, her voice calm and clear despite her circumstances. "Thomas, do not let him make you choose between your honor and my safety. I have faced worse than this and survived." Her words broke something loose in Thomas's chest. She was trying to protect him even as she faced assault or worse. In that moment, he understood that his choice had already been made weeks ago, when he first looked into her eyes and saw a person rather than a prisoner. "Johnson," he said quietly, "I'm going to count to 3. If you're not out of that cell by then, I will shoot you." "You're bluffing." 1. Johnson's eyes widened slightly as he realized that Thomas was deadly serious. 2. "McKenna, you can't." 3. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but Johnson finally moved, stumbling out of the cell with his hands raised. "You've lost your mind," he muttered. "They'll court-martial you for this." "Probably," Thomas agreed, keeping his weapon trained on Johnson while he backed toward the cell door. "Ayanna, are you hurt?" "I am unharmed," she replied, though he could hear the tremor in her voice. "Good. Private Johnson, you're going to walk very slowly to the brig and lock yourself in. If you make any sudden movements or call out, I will put a bullet in your back." Johnson's face was pale now, the alcohol-fueled bravado replaced by the sobering realization that his actions had consequences. "The colonel will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Thomas said. "Now move." After securing Johnson in the brig, Thomas returned to Ayanna's cell to find her sitting calmly on her cot, as though nothing had happened. But he could see the way her hands shook slightly as she smoothed her hair back into place. "Are you really unharmed?" he asked gently. "He did not touch me. You arrived before." She looked up at him. "You saved me. But at what cost to yourself?" Thomas holstered his weapon and sat heavily in the chair outside her cell. "Johnson was right about one thing, they'll court-martial me for this." Drawing a weapon on a fellow soldier, threatening to shoot him, insubordination. He shook his head. "My military career is over. I am sorry." "I'm not," Thomas said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "For the first time in my life, I did something because it was right instead of because it was ordered. That feels like progress." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each contemplating the gravity of what had just occurred. Then, Ayanna spoke quietly. "There is something you should know," she said. "I have been planning to escape." Thomas looked up sharply. "What?" "Not because I do not appreciate what you have done for me, but because I cannot remain caged while my people suffer on the reservations. I have been watching, learning, waiting for the right opportunity." She met his eyes. "Tonight's events have convinced me that I cannot wait any longer. Ayanna, if you try to escape now, they'll assume I helped you. After what just happened with Johnson, they will assume that regardless," she said simply. "Your fate is already sealed. The question is whether mine will be as well." Thomas realized she was right. His confrontation with Johnson had eliminated any possibility of his continuing to serve at the fort. He would face court-martial regardless of what Ayanna did or didn't do. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow night, during the change of guard. Johnson will be in the brig, and whoever replaces him will not yet know the routines." She paused. "Unless you think I should not try." Thomas found himself at the final crossroads of a journey that had begun the moment he first saw dignity in chains. He could try to talk her out of escaping, could hope that the congressional committee would somehow vindicate both of them, could cling to the fading possibility that duty and conscience might somehow align. Or he could choose love over law, freedom over order, and help the woman he cared about find her way back to the mountains that knew her name. I don't think you should try, he said quietly. Ayana's face fell, and he saw disappointment flicker in her eyes. I think I should help you, he continued. The next evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains and painted the desert sky in shades of amber and rose, Thomas made his final preparations. He had spent the day gathering supplies, a horse from the remuda that wouldn't be missed until morning, food and water for several days' travel, a warm coat that would keep her alive in the desert night. Most importantly, he had studied the patrol schedules and identified a window of opportunity that would give them the best chance of success. At 10 o'clock, when the guards changed shifts and the night patrol was focused on the external perimeter, Thomas walked to Ayana's cell one last time as her keeper. She was ready, wearing the warmest clothes she had and carrying nothing that would slow her down. Are you certain about this? He asked as he unlocked her door. Once we leave the fort, there's no going back for either of us. I have never been more certain of anything, she replied. They made their way through the fort's back passages, staying in shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might encounter other soldiers. Thomas's knowledge of the garrison's layout served them well. He knew which buildings would be empty, which paths would be unguarded, which routes would take them to the horse he had prepared. The mare was a sturdy bay that had been trained for long-distance patrol work. Not the fastest horse in the remuda, but reliable and sure-footed in difficult terrain. Thomas had already secured the supplies to her saddle and positioned her near a gap in the wall that was used for bringing in supply wagons. The patrol won't reach this section for another 20 minutes, he told Ayana as he helped her mount. Ride north toward the dragoons, then east once you reach the foothills. Stay off the main trails and avoid water sources where cavalry patrols might camp. She looked down at him from the saddle. Come with me. The invitation hung in the